I did not beg for anything in this life. I built a construction supply company from a single flatbed truck and a line of credit that terrified my late wife more than it excited her, and I turned it into the largest independent supplier in 3 counties. But the hardest lesson I ever learned came not from 40 years of contracts and cash flow and men who tried to cheat me on delivery weights. It came from my own son, standing in my daughter-in-law's dining room, pointing a finger at my chest in front of 19 relatives, and telling me that blood only counts for so much when the mortgage is due. My name is Walter Grant. I am 68 years old, and until 11 months ago, I believed I had raised a good man. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what I gave up before you understand what was taken from me. I lost my wife, Carol, to a stroke 9 years ago. She went in the kitchen, reaching for a coffee mug, and by the time the paramedics got her to the hospital, she was already gone. My son, Marcus, was 26 then, freshly married to a woman named Diane, and I remember standing at the graveside thinking that the only thing left of the life Carol and I built was that boy standing across from me in a black suit that didn't quite fit him yet. I threw myself into the business after that. It was the only language of grief I understood. Carol used to say I loved that company the way other men loved fishing or golf obsessively, quietly, on Sunday mornings when I should have been doing something else. After she died, that obsession became the only thing keeping me upright. Grant Supply grew from 4 trucks to 22. I opened a second yard in the next county. I put Marcus on the payroll as a project coordinator, paid him well above what the position was worth, because he was my son and because I didn't know how else to say I love you to a grown man who'd stopped hugging me sometime around his 20th birthday. 3 years ago, Marcus came to me with a business plan. He wanted to open his own logistics brokerage, cut out the middleman, he said, connect suppliers directly with contractors, take a percentage on every load. It was a decent idea. Not a great one, but decent. He needed $80,000 to get it running. I didn't hesitate. I wrote the check the same week. No contract, no interest, nothing but a handshake and a hug that lasted about 2 seconds too short for my liking. I also co-signed the mortgage on the house he and Diane bought in Cedar Ridge, a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch that Diane had wanted since she was a little girl, or so she told me at the closing dinner. I didn't just co-sign it, I paid the down payment, $60,000, wired straight to the title company, because Marcus said the brokerage needed every dollar of its own capital to get off the ground, and he didn't want to touch it for a house payment. I tell you all of this not to sound like a martyr. I tell you because 6 months ago, when the trouble started, Marcus stood in front of his own family and told a room full of people that I had never given him anything, that everything he had, he'd built himself. And the sickest part is watching people nod along, because none of them knew the truth, and I hadn't said a word to correct him. Here is where the story really begins. 2 years after the house closed, I made a decision that would end up being the smartest thing I ever did, though at the time it felt like something closer to defeat. My doctor found a shadow on a scan. Nothing came of it in the end. 6 months of tests, a biopsy that turned out clean, a scare, and nothing more. But in the middle of that uncertainty, not knowing whether I'd be around to run Grant Supply for another decade or another year, I did something I'd never told a living soul about, not even my own son. I restructured the company. I didn't sell it. I didn't hand it over. I moved 80% of Grant Supply's ownership into a holding company. I named after Carol's maiden name, Ashworth Capital, with myself as the sole trustee and a document sitting in my attorney's safe that named Marcus as the eventual beneficiary, on the condition that he prove himself capable of running something without me propping it up first. My attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Renata Coelho, who'd handled my affairs for 15 years, was the only person besides me who knew the structure existed. To the outside world, to Marcus, to Diane, to anyone who looked at a tax filing or asked around town, Walter Grant still just owned some trucks and a couple of gravel yards. A hard-working man doing fine, nothing more. I told myself I was protecting the company from an IRS mess or a bad lawsuit. That was true, partly. But if I'm honest with you, the way I haven't been honest with anyone in 11 months, I think some part of me already sensed what was coming. Some part of me had started noticing the way Marcus looked at my truck keys when we sat at dinner. The way Diane asked, almost too casually, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things now that I was getting older. I didn't want to believe it. So I built a wall instead of asking the question. The scare passed. The biopsy came back clean. I went back to work like nothing had happened, and I never mentioned Ashworth Capital to another soul. I figured I'd bring it up eventually, when the timing felt right, when Marcus had grown into the kind of man I could hand a legacy to without watching it crumble in his hands. That timing never came. Instead, what came was last Christmas. Diane's family always hosted the big Christmas dinner, 19 or 20 people, crammed into that Cedar Ridge dining room I'd paid the down payment on. Her parents, her sister's family, a couple of cousins from out of state, and me, sitting at the far end of the table the way I had every year since the wedding, the odd widower nobody quite knew what to do with during the toasts. I noticed something was wrong the moment I walked in. Marcus wouldn't look at me directly. Diane's mother kept glancing my way and then quickly finding something fascinating about her wine glass. There was a tension in that house that had nothing to do with overcooked turkey or somebody's political opinions coming out after the second bottle of wine. It happened right after dessert. Marcus stood up at the head of the table, the way you'd stand to give a toast, except there was no glass raised, no soft smile. His face was flushed red, and I recognized that look. I'd seen it on him since he was 7 years old. Right before he was about to say something he couldn't take back. "I want to say something," he announced, and the table went quiet the way tables do, when everyone senses a wreck about to happen and can't look away. "Dad, I've been talking to Diane and to a financial advisor, and I think it's time we're honest about something." I remember setting my fork down very carefully. I remember thinking, absurdly, of Carol, and how she would have known exactly what to say to diffuse this before it detonated. "The brokerage isn't doing what we thought it would," Marcus continued. "The market's brutal right now, and I've been carrying you a little, Dad, if we're being real. The insurance you still have on the old truck fleet, the health coverage supplement, all of it's coming out of money that should be going toward this family's future. Diane and I talked about it, and starting January, we need you to start covering your fair share. Real numbers. Or honestly, at some point, we need to talk about whether it makes sense for you to keep living the way you're living." 19 faces turned toward me. Diane's father cleared his throat and studied the tablecloth. Diane herself sat with her arms crossed, chin lifted, wearing an expression I can only describe as satisfaction dressed up as concern. "Pay your fair share, Dad," Marcus said again, louder now, like he needed the room to hear it a second time to believe he had the nerve to say it. "Or we need to seriously talk about you finding your own place. I can't keep bankrolling you forever just because you're my father." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it at that table. Because Marcus Grant, the boy whose Little League fees I paid, whose braces I paid, whose $80,000 business and $200,000 down payment I paid, stood up in a house I helped buy and accused me, his father, of bankrolling nothing but my own retirement off his hard work. Diane leaned toward her sister and said, just loud enough for half the table to hear, "Let's see how well he manages without us carrying him." I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my napkin down or storm out like some man in a soap opera. I have spent 40 years in rooms with contractors trying to shortchange me on a shipment, and I have learned that the man who loses his composure first has already lost the negotiation. So I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and said the only thing that came to mind in that moment. "Understood," I said. "I'll figure something out." Then I stood, thanked Diane's mother for the meal, and drove home in silence. The Christmas lights of Cedar Ridge blurring past my windshield like something out of a dream I couldn't quite wake from. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study with a glass of bourbon I never touched, and I thought about every version of Marcus I had loved across 68 years. The toddler who fell asleep on my chest during Sunday football, the teenager who wrecked my truck and cried harder about disappointing me than about the totaled vehicle, the young man who stood at his mother's grave and gripped my hand so tightly I had bruises the next day. And I thought about the man who had just told a room full of his in-laws that his father was a financial burden to be managed. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped grieving and started thinking clearly for the first time in a decade. The next morning, I called Renata. "I need to talk to you about Ashworth," I said. "Everything. All of it." She met me at her office 2 days after Christmas, and for 3 hours we went through every document, every account, every insurance policy Marcus thought he'd been quietly propping up. Here is what he didn't know, sitting in his house accusing me of leeching off his generosity. The insurance on the old truck fleet he mentioned was not costing him a cent. It was paid automatically from a grant supply operating account he had no visibility into because I had never turned over full financial transparency of the holding structure, only the day-to-day numbers of the trucking operation he managed. The health coverage supplement was, in fact, a policy I paid for myself out of Ashworth Capital's distributions that also happened to cover him and Diane, a fact he had apparently never bothered to check. In other words, my son stood up at Christmas dinner and accused me of being a burden using two expenses that I was paying for that were quietly benefiting him that he didn't understand well enough to realize he was insulting the hand still partially feeding him. But that isn't even the part that mattered most. Renata pulled one more folder from the stack, and her expression told me before her words did. "Walter," she said, "I need you to look at this." 3 weeks before Christmas, someone had contacted her office, not Marcus directly, but a paralegal working under a different attorney, requesting documentation related to my medical history from 2 years earlier, referencing the biopsy, the scan, the whole scare I'd never discussed with anyone but Renata and my doctor. The request cited concerns about the client's capacity to manage his financial affairs and asked, delicately, about the possibility of a guardianship or conservatorship evaluation. I sat very still in that office chair. "Who filed this?" I asked. Renata slid a cover letter across the desk. The attorney's name meant nothing to me, but the referral line at the bottom did. It read, "Referred by D. Grant, Diane." My son's wife had gone looking for a lawyer to question my mental competency, using a medical scare I'd shared with no one but my attorney and my doctor, 3 weeks before her husband stood up and accused me of freeloading. They hadn't just decided I was a burden over Christmas dinner. They had been building a case, quietly, for months, and the eviction speech at that table wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the opening move of a plan that had already been in motion. I want to tell you, I felt rage in that moment. What I actually felt was something colder and more clarifying. The same feeling I used to get 30 years ago when a competitor tried to undercut me on a bid I knew I could win anyway. Somewhere underneath the hurt, a part of me that had built an empire out of a flatbed truck simply said, "All right, let's see what you're really capable of, son." "How did they even get access to my medical records enough to reference them?" I asked Renata. She hesitated. "Do you remember about 8 months ago, you had Marcus listed as an emergency contact update at the clinic? You mentioned it to me in passing." I did remember. It had felt like such a small, ordinary thing at the time, a form at a checkup, a box check because Marcus was my only living family, and it seemed practical. I hadn't thought twice about it. Diane apparently had thought about it quite a lot. I spent the next 4 weeks doing 3 things at once, and I want you to understand that none of them involved a single confrontation, a single raised voice, a single dramatic phone call. I have learned that the men who win are rarely the ones shouting the loudest. First, I had Renata formally close every gap Diane's inquiry could exploit. A cognitive evaluation with my own physician, thorough and unambiguous, entered into the record. A reaffirmed power of attorney naming Renata, not Marcus, as my agent should anything happen to me. Every loose thread that could have been pulled at in a courtroom, tied off and documented before anyone could reach for it again. Second, I quietly began unwinding every piece of informal financial support flowing towards Cedar Ridge. Not with a phone call, not with an argument. I simply let contracts lapse and subsidies end the way any business relationship ends when the underlying agreement changes. The health coverage supplement for Marcus and Diane administratively terminated, effective the first of the new year, folded back into my personal policy alone, with a form letter from the insurer that named no villain, only a policy adjustment. The truck fleet insurance line restructured so Grant Supply covered only its own vehicles, not the 2 personal vehicles Marcus had quietly added to that account years earlier without my full knowledge. Guarantees I'd made on business lines of credit for the brokerage, reviewed by Renata, and where I had discretion, gently allowed to expire rather than renew. I didn't take a single thing that was rightfully theirs. I simply stopped extending things that were never theirs to begin with. Third, and this is the part that mattered most, I asked Renata to prepare full documentation of everything I had provided to Marcus and Diane over the previous 6 years. Every check, every wire transfer, every co-signature, every dollar. Not to use against them in some petty scorekeeping exercise, but because I finally understood that if Diane was building a legal case questioning my competency, I needed a complete, undeniable record showing exactly who had been carrying whom. I said nothing to Marcus during any of this, not one word. He called twice in January, brief, awkward calls about nothing in particular, testing the water, I think, to see whether the Christmas conversation had actually registered with me or whether I'd forgive and forget the way I always had. I was pleasant. I asked about his brokerage. I did not mention Ashworth Capital or Renata or the folder with Diane's name at the bottom of a letter requesting a guardianship evaluation. The break came in February, and it came from a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. Though in hindsight, I should have seen it coming from the moment Marcus opened a brokerage with $80,000 of my money and not $1 of his own risk. Marcus's business had been struggling for over a year, a fact he downplayed at Christmas dinner when he claimed he was carrying me financially. In reality, the brokerage was carrying almost nothing. Two of his major contractor accounts had pulled out the previous fall. He had a line of credit at the bank that was, I would later learn, personally guaranteed not by him, but by a piece of collateral he'd offered without asking me. A 12% stake in Grant Supply's trucking operation that he believed, incorrectly, was still legally his to pledge, based on an old operating agreement from before I restructured everything into Ashworth Capital. When the bank came calling in February to formalize that collateral against his failing line of credit, they discovered the trucking operation Marcus believed he could pledge no longer belonged to Grant Supply in the simple, direct way the old paperwork described. It belonged to a holding company. A holding company Marcus Grant had never heard of, structured 2 years before he ever thought to sit down with a lawyer and question his father's mental fitness. The bank's attorney called Renata. Renata called me. "He's about to find out," she said. "There's no way around it now." I remember feeling strangely calm when she told me. Not triumphant, just settled, the way you feel when a decision you made months ago quietly, finally, arrives at its natural conclusion. Marcus showed up at my house on a Saturday morning in late February, no call ahead, driving too fast up my long gravel driveway the way he used to when he was 19, and angry about a curfew. I was in my study when I heard the car door, and I watched through the window as he walked toward the porch, a folder clutched in one hand, his face doing something between confusion and fury. I opened the door before he could knock. "What is Ashworth Capital?" he said, no greeting, no pretense. "The bank says my collateral is worthless because some holding company owns the trucking division." "What did you do?" "Come in," I said. "Sit down. I'll explain everything." He didn't sit. He stood in my living room, the same living room where he'd learned to walk, where Carol used to read to him before bed, and he demanded to know why I had secretly restructured a company his family depended on. So I told him, calmly, the way you'd explain a contract to a client who'd finally asked to see the fine print he should have read years earlier. I told him about the scare, the biopsy, the decision I made to protect Grant Supply, and, eventually, him, with a structure that would pass to him once he'd proven he could manage something of that size without leaning on me for every dollar. I told him it had been designed as a gift with conditions, not a punishment. "You should have told me," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that, for one unguarded second, sounded exactly like the boy who used to cry after wrecking my truck. "I should have," I agreed. "But Marcus, I need you to sit down, because there's something else you need to see." I handed him the folder Renata had prepared. He read through it standing up, his hands trembling slightly on the pages, every check, every wire, every dollar I'd given him and Diane over 6 years, laid out plainly, followed by the letter. The one with the referral line at the bottom, referred by D. Grant. I watched something break across his face as he read it, a kind of understanding arriving too late and too fast at the same time. "She told me it was just background research," he said quietly. "In case something happened to you, she said it was responsible planning." "Marcus," I said, "she was building a case to have me declared incompetent using a medical scare I told no one about except my lawyer and my doctor. 3 weeks before you stood up in her parents' dining room and told everyone I was a burden you'd been secretly carrying." He sat down then, finally, on the edge of the couch, the folder open on his knees, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Outside, I could hear a truck downshifting on the county road, the ordinary sound of a Saturday morning continuing on without any awareness of what was collapsing quietly inside my living room. "I didn't know about the letter," he finally said. "Dad, I swear to you, I didn't know she'd done that." I believed him. That's the strange thing about a story like this. It is rarely as clean as one villain and one victim. Marcus had been careless, arrogant, and cruel at that dinner table, saying things about a father who had given him more than he understood. But the letter, the quiet legal groundwork to question my competency, the calculated timing 3 weeks before Christmas that had a different signature on it entirely. I didn't hand Marcus back the 12% stake he'd tried, unknowingly, to pledge to a bank. I didn't restore the health coverage supplement or the truck insurance either, not that week. What I did instead was simpler, and, I think, more honest than either forgiveness or punishment. "I'm going to tell you exactly what Ashworth Capital is," I said, "and exactly what it would take for you to actually inherit it the way I originally intended." And then you're going to go home and you're going to have a very different conversation with your wife than the one you had with me at Christmas. I won't walk you through every detail of what came next. The months of Marcus slowly, painfully separating his professional life from Diane's ambitions. The divorce filing that came in April, the brokerage he eventually folded and rebuilt smaller, leaner, entirely on his own credit this time, with no guarantee from me and no pledge of anything that wasn't fully his to pledge. I will tell you that it was not easy to watch, and I will tell you that I did not rescue him from a single consequence of it. 40 years in business taught me that a company propped up by someone else's money never learns to stand on its own, and neither does a man. What I will tell you is what happened this past Thanksgiving, 11 months after that Christmas dinner in Cedar Ridge. Marcus came alone. No Diane, the divorce had finalized in September. Quiet and without the theatrics I half expected given how it began. He arrived early, before any of the extended family, and he found me in the kitchen, where I was doing something I hadn't done in years. Attempting Carol's stuffing recipe from a card in her handwriting that I kept in a drawer and rarely had the courage to pull out. He stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. "I owe you an apology I should have given you 11 months ago," he said. "Not the folder of receipts kind. The real kind." I set down the wooden spoon and looked at my son thinner than he'd been at Christmas. A little grayer at the temples than a 32-year-old ought to be, but standing in a way I hadn't seen since he was a much younger man, before the brokerage, before Diane, before he'd started measuring his worth against a house he never should have needed his father to buy. "I'm listening," I said. "I stood in a room full of her family and called you a burden," he said, "when you'd paid for the roof over that room. I let her convince me you were getting old and unreliable, because it was easier than admitting I'd built a business I couldn't actually run, and I needed someone to blame that wasn't me. I let her go after your medical records because some part of me wanted to believe there was a shortcut to the life you built instead of actually building it." He stopped, and for a moment I thought that might be all of it. The kind of apology a man rehearses in his car and cuts short once he's actually standing in the room. "I'm not asking for the company back," he added. "I'm not even asking for the insurance or any of it. I just didn't want another year to go by with you thinking I don't understand what you sacrificed." I want to tell you I forgave him instantly, that we hugged, and the past 11 months dissolved into a Hallmark ending. That is not quite what happened, and I think you deserve the honest version rather than the easy one. What I told him was this: that I loved him the way I'd loved him since the day the hospital handed him to me, wrinkled and furious and entirely mine to protect, and that love had never once been in question, not even at that Christmas table. But love and trust are not the same current running through the same wire, and trust, once you cut it, doesn't reconnect itself just because someone finally says the right words in a kitchen over a bowl of stuffing. "You can earn the trust back," I told him. The love was never going anywhere. He nodded, and something in his shoulders eased, the way a man's do when he's been carrying a weight he finally sets down, even knowing there's more road ahead of him before he's truly free of it. Ashworth Capital is still mine. I review the terms with Renata every year, and I have started, slowly, letting Marcus see the full financial picture of Grant Supply, teaching him the way I should have taught him from the beginning, not with a check written in silence, but with the harder work of actually understanding what it costs to build something and keep it standing. He rents a small apartment now, 20 minutes from my place, paid entirely with his own money, on a mattress he bought himself with cash he saved himself. He still calls me most Sundays. Sometimes we talk about nothing, a game on television, a truck he's thinking about buying, whether the stuffing recipe needs more sage. Sometimes we don't talk about anything at all, and that, too, feels like something being rebuilt, one quiet Sunday at a time. I am 68 years old, and I spent 40 years believing the hardest thing I would ever build was a company. I was wrong. The hardest thing I ever had to build, and am still building, one careful year at a time, is a son who understands that the people who love you the most are never the ones you should feel entitled to, and never the ones you get to spend without ever once checking the balance.